Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you very much for joining us today at this workshop on single-use plastic food packaging and its alternatives, recommendation from life cycle assessment. We would really first of all, we would like to thank you for joining us today. And we have an exciting lineup of speakers. And thank you, Margarita, for moving ahead. Before we enter into the content for today's session, let me just take us through on how we can interact today. I believe everybody is now familiar with the Zoom as a platform, but just as a refresher, there will be all participants are muted and we'll be interacting today through the chat, or for the questions, please do send them through to the Q&A box. We will try to assign them to the panelists and answer to as many questions as possible today. We really hope to have a very interactive session, and we will have the possibility to raise hand and unmute depending on the time. So priority will be given to question and answer that are submitted to us through the Q&A box. And if we have a bit of time left over, we will give a possibility to unmute, but that is not for sure. Moving on, please note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and copy of the presentation that will be shared with you today will be made publicly available after the event. You have already received from PIPA a preliminary presentation of the scope of the study, the archetypes, and some of the main literature that we have so far started to review. So you have already that presentation available at hand, but we will be sharing any other presentation that will be presented to you today, as well as this recording. Now, to get a sense of who is in the room and to understand who our colleagues are today, we would like to have a small poll with you. So please choose the option that best describes the organization that you work for. A poll should appear shortly on your screens. And you will be able to select the option that you prefer. I still don't see it on my end, Pippa. I don't know if...
Yes, I think everyone's almost finished. We have 30 of 30 participants, so I think I'll end it unless we had anyone else join.
Wonderful. And you will be able to share the results also?
It should be on everyone's screen.
There we go. Now I can also see it. That's great. So we have quite an even spread between private sector, academia, and international organizations. We have some students participating with us today and some NGOs and CSOs. So that's great mix of participation. Thank you so much. And just in terms of the agenda, so I will be presenting to you a short overview of the context. So where does this meta study comes from? What is the rationale behind it? Then we will have with us Ellie Chang from the US EPA. US EPA is the main funder for this meta study. So she will be taking us through why is this topic of relevance. Pippa Notten from TGA ThinkSpace will be diving into the summary of the LCA literature on the single-use plastic food packaging. Of course, in between presentation, we will always have a possibility for question and answers. And the main discussion will happen after Pippa Notten has presented, and we will have an interactive discussion there. And then finally, we will have Anne-Marie Boulet from Marilka presenting about the cross-cutting issues with particular focus on the marine impact in life cycle assessment. So as I mentioned, the main speakers today will be Ellie Chang from the US EPA, Philippa Notten from TGA ThinkSpace, and Anne-Marie Boulet from Marilka. Starting with me, I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, so I'll do that now. My name is Claudia Giacovelli. I'm a program officer from the Life Cycle Initiative at the United Nations Environment Program based in Paris. I'm managing the activities on around single-use plastic products at UNEP, along with other colleagues of the unit. And today I will be presenting to you some of an overview of the studies that we have so far conducted that will put also the food packaging report into context. So as we know, why did we, first of all, we embarked into these journeys? Because single-use plastic products present a significant environmental problem and a global challenge. As we know, 80% of the marine litter comes from human activities on land. So land-based activity, in fact, are the main source for marine litter that then ends up clogging our rivers and our sea. What we are trying to do is to apply a life cycle approach to try and understand and address the plastic pollution problem. Now, most of us in the room will be very familiar with what is life cycle thinking, but let me just quickly explain what that is in case for the benefit of those people in the audience that might not be very familiar. So when we speak of life cycle thinking, we really are looking at the environmental impacts of a product or a service along its entire life cycle, from the extraction of the resources until the end of life. So an LCA will highlight the area of highest potential impact along the value chain and identify trade-offs between the various impacts. These studies are conducted, so these food packaging studies, as well as other studies that we have been developing, and I will present to you in a bit what other work we have been doing. They have been done mostly by the Life Cycle Initiative. The Life Cycle Initiative is a public-private multi-stakeholder partnership hosted by UNEP. The main objective of this partnership is to try to enable the credible use of life cycle knowledge by private and public decision makers. So basically, it's trying to play a role of an interface between policy, science and policies, and trying to build consensus around methodological approaches for life cycle assessments. As I mentioned, there is a series of LCA meta-studies on single-use plastic products that the Life Cycle Initiative and UNEP have been conducting. That has been a work that we have embarked in following a request from member states at the 4th session of the UN Environment Assembly in March 2019. Member states deliberated and asked UNEP to collect information on the life cycle assessment, on the life cycle impact of single-use plastic products along their whole life cycle. So we have started to collect information and to provide recommendations on a series of single-use plastic products. At the moment, recommendations are available on shopping bags, plastic bottles, or bottles in general, because in every LCA meta study that we have done, in fact, we try to compare the life cycle impact of single-use plastic product, a specific product, versus the single-use alternative or the reusable alternative. So we have recommendation for bags, bottles, takeaway packaging. We have on caps, on tableware. We have issued an LCA meta studies on nappies, on menstrual products. We are currently finalizing an LCA meta study on face masks. And this that we are workshopping here with you today is around food packaging, retail food packaging. In terms of the type of tools that we try to develop as part of these meta studies, besides for the recommendation, we also try to develop some tools that can be of easy guidance to countries, region, policymakers, cities, in fact, to understand what does the the science tell us. So we developed this type of matrix where we plot on one hand the geographical and technological context, ranging from when there is no formal waste management and poor recycling support, all the way the scenario in which there is formal waste management and recycling infrastructure is in place. And we map it also across the type of consumer, because consumer behavior, as we know, it's extremely important for the type of impact along the life cycle of products. So we differentiate between equal cost conscious consumer or indifferent consumers. So for example, if we take the first row, so there is no formal waste management and poor recycling support, but we have a eco-conscious consumer that will reuse a cap many times, for example, then in that case, the science tells us that reusable caps are better, whether they are ceramic, glass, stainless steel, or bamboo. Instead, if we remain in the same geographical and technological context, so with no formal waste management and poor recycling support, but we have a consumer that is indifferent, so that uses the caps inefficiently, so doesn't reuse much and will litter, then in that case, for example, the science tells us that in that scenario, single use might be better. And bioplastic comes out there as a cross-cutting possibility. But in that case, we would suggest that, for example, behavioral change should be encouraged, because overall, the life cycle assessment studies, they've been telling us that reusables score better from an environmental perspective. So this matrix is mostly really to try and guide and provide a easy to read map of what the science tells us and what could be the possibilities to try and influence changes in the policy and in the behavior of consumers and the private sector. Thank you, Margarita. We can move to the next slide. So in terms of the overall funding, as you've seen, we have analyzed several products and we have tried to draw what are the common conclusions that we have if we look at the life cycle assessment of single-use plastic products. So far what we have noticed that is very common to all the products that we have analyzed is that what is most problematic is the single-use nature of product rather than the material that these products are made of. So it's not so much that they are made of plastic, but it's the fact that they are single use, in fact. In the COVID context, it's really important how we use this product and not the product themselves that guarantee the safety. So whether they're single use or reusable is not in the COVID context is not because a product is single use that will guarantee the safety, but is more how you use these products. And another key finding that we had is that cleverly designed products should be durable and lighter. The lighter a product weight, and this is particularly true for single-use product, a lighter a product weight, the lower its environmental impact. So what we encourage is that member states would try to keep resources at the highest value for as long as possible in the economy and try to transition from single-use plastic product to reusable alternatives. There is really not one single solution to plastic product pollution, but in its context and country-specific limitation, what we have noticed is that taking a life cycle approach can really help in making the right decision. So if now we look at this specific meta study on food packaging, first of all, I would like to thank the US EPA for entrusting UNEP with the funding necessary to conduct this meta-analysis. And we have partnered with TGH ThinkSpace to deliver on the study. We aim to develop recommendation for policymakers, for businesses, and there will be some recommendation also for LCA practitioners regarding the packaging of supermarket retail food. We have issued several calls for reviewers, and thank you so much for responding to those calls and for joining us today. Reviewers, so today there is an opportunity, of course, you can drop us a message in the chat or in the Q&A box to leave your email address if you have not done so already, and we will be happy to incorporate you, to take contact with you, evaluate the curriculum, and incorporate you when relevant to the review committee for this study. We will call again for literature. If you have any relevant study that you think can be fit for purpose and contribute to the finding of this meta-analysis, we will be happy to receive more literature from you. In terms of reviews, how the process will unfold. At the moment, we have done a preliminary literature review, and we will start drafting. After this workshop, we will gather feedback from you. We will start drafting the meta-analysis, and we will be able to share the first draft for review to the review committee by April 2022, and then by August, September next year, we will be able to share the final draft before it goes into layout and design. Finally, so I touched upon this already slightly, but the objective of today's workshop is really to present the finding from the literature review that we have so far gathered. We really want to hear from your expert opinion on what you think of the current scope and approach that we have undertaken for the study, and gain insight on how to structure the study. So we will have some interactive discussion later on. And of course, we want to make sure that this is an open and inclusive process. That's why we are engaging with you experts from the very beginning of the development process of this study. And I will pause there. Thank you very much. And I will ask our dear colleague and founder, Ellie Chang from the US EPA, to join me. If you can put the camera on, that would be great. And I will let you the floor. Ellie Chang has worked for the US Environment Protection Agency for over 6 years, and she currently leads their international food loss and waste portfolio, and also works on other issues related to sustainable food system and the international trade of plastic and plastic waste. Prior to joining the international office, Ellie worked with the Native American and Alaska Native communities on improving the implementation of environmental policies on tribal lands. So thank you very much, and help me to welcome Ellie Chang to our panel today. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you to Claudia, Laurence, Margarita, Pippa, and the other organizers for inviting me to this workshop today. It's been really wonderful getting to know you through this work, and we're really excited to be continuing these efforts with UNEP to further understand the key role that life cycle assessments contribute when exploring alternatives to plastic and plastic packaging, especially as it relates to food systems. We're really seeing this issue pop up in many, many different fora. We recognize that plastic pollution, especially as it's affected our shared marine environments, is a global problem that we have to solve together. And these efforts couldn't be more relevant to US government policy priorities right now. Many of you might be familiar that US Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently announced that the US government will support the launch of a process to develop a global treaty that will address ocean plastic pollution. Pretty huge. EPA is also working with the US State Department, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, and other federal agencies to identify how the US can contribute both to our domestic and international policies and programs related to marine plastic pollution and plastic waste. In the US, just a few weeks ago, I think, maybe 2 weeks ago, EPA launched our national recycling strategy, which is just part one of a series of strategies that will look more towards a circular economy approach. And now that the recycling strategy is out, we're encouraging many organizations within the US to lead actions from the strategy, which includes more than 45 actions needed to address the major challenges in our recycling system. These range from improving markets for recycled commodities, increasing collection and improving materials management infrastructure, and also broadening our vision to help the nation address the full impacts of materials in our communities. But we also know that recycling is not enough to solve this issue alone. We know that we need to strengthen our efforts to reduce, reuse, and recover materials and products such as plastics. And that's why the strategy is just the first in a series of steps of strategies on building a circular economy for all. We're also really excited that within the US, Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and this will provide EPA specifically, and EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear before, the Environmental Protection Agency with $350 million over 5 years to improve solid waste management in the US through a grants management program that focuses on recycling plastics and batteries and other products. So I can really think of no better time than now for UNEP to be partnering with EPA on these efforts. We really need to understand alternatives to plastic packaging for food and other related products. And then I also wanted to recognize the US Congress for passing the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act in 2020, which included many actions to address plastic pollution. This legislation provided EPA with the authority to issue grants related to solid waste management programs and infrastructure, and it also allowed us to develop a strategy that identifies the challenges and actions needed to improve post-consumer materials management and infrastructure. We're working right now to identify those actions that are needed to help reduce plastic waste and other materials that end up in our waterways and oceans. And there's a lot of reasons why I'm optimistic about our future, especially because of our partnership between UNEP and EPA. Again, I'm really, really appreciative to be here at this virtual workshop today and to hear and learn from you all about where we are with this study, learn about more existing literature and how this work can inform how we as consumers and businesses and governments and stakeholders can better perceive and use packaging options in a more sustainable way. So that's all from me. Thank you again for having me today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ellie. And it's quite exciting to hear this renewed energy that is coming from the US state government. And it's wonderful. And again, many thanks and appreciation of the support that you are giving through the development of this study, which we believe it's quite timely as well and relevant. In terms of, I received one question through the Q&A box. I would like to pause just 1 second to see if there are any questions to address to you or to what I just presented. There was one question in the Q&A box, and I think everybody can see the question and the answer that I just posted. So I will move to the next presentation. So I will ask Pippa Notten, Director of TGH Think Space, to put on your camera and to take us through this summary of the LCA literature on single-use plastic food packaging. And in the meantime, please, to the audience, please feel free to post your question in the Q&A chat or in the Q&A box. We will try to respond to them either live when the discussion session open, or the panelists will be able to address them in writing as well. Thank you, Pippa. Over to you.
Thank you, Claudia, and hello everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, depending where you are. Yeah, so I think Claudia's already set the scene quite well, so I'll dive in. We already shared a sort of our first literature pass on quite this broad topic and quite an active topic in LCA, as I'm sure many of you who are involved know how active packaging has been in LCA. But here we have the very specific lens of sort of food packaging, sort of retail food packaging or supermarket food packaging. Just to note as well, I put in the link, if anybody didn't get my email with the summary, I have put a link in the chat and you can download it from there, because what I have here now is I didn't want to list loads of studies, but one of the things that we are calling for is if we have missed anything. So obviously we need to show you what we have in our shortlist so that you can put forward if we have missed anything. But in our sort of fairly wide literature, we've got close on 100 studies that we've really identified as relevant, directly relevant on LCA and on food packaging. So obviously we need something, we're not just looking at food packaging, it's specifically life cycle assessments, a lens on food packaging. And then even within those widest number of studies, our meta-analysis very much needs to look at case studies, and so we're really looking for, in a way, comparisons that look at one type of food packaging compared to another. So again, that brought us to a smaller group of studies of about 40 that we've identified. And then, of course, there we had to have some criteria that allowed us to shortlist studies, and the more detailed criteria was in the slides that we shared. But just to go through those briefly, they're on the right side of the slide here. So within our first criteria was obviously it needs to be on topic of supermarket food packaging, retail food packaging, and that it needs to have alternatives. It's not just a deep dive on a single packaging type, but we really want to look at, as it's all about recommendations between alternatives. So it needs to be a case study that looks at alternatives. The other criteria that we had for shortlisting was that it needs to be a life cycle assessment. So it really needs the full life cycle view, the full value chain of raw materials through to disposal. And it also needs the life cycle assessment, in that it needs to be a full set of life cycle indicators in accordance with sort of the life cycle assessment methodology. So not just carbon footprint or energy analysis, we want studies that look at a full set of criteria. And another important one, of course, is if we're going to do a meta-analysis, it needs to be a well-described study. So there needs to be good transparency in terms of what's covered, enough detail on data sources and functional units and all the goal and scoping aspects that go into an LCA. So we need to be able to see that. So a well transparent and well presented study. We also cut off at 10 years, somewhat arbitrary, but this is a relatively rich field. So we had that luxury of maybe cutting off the really old studies. There are a number of pre-2010 studies, but also in certain fields, things like bioplastics have changed a lot in the last 10 years. So it's important, I think, to, we are looking at the more recent, preferably than very old studies. So we're cutting off within the last 10 years. And then another important one, of course, within LCA is peer review. So we do want studies that have been peer reviewed, especially important in industry reports. We obviously need them to have been peer reviewed, and then a lot of them are the studies we've come across, of course, are journal articles, in which case it needs to be a peer reviewed journal for us to have included it in our shortlist. And geographically, so less of a cutoff criteria, but we were also, because we were aiming for global recommendations, we would try and select studies to be as geographically diverse as possible. And then the last one also, and because we are an English-speaking team, we are limited to studies that are available in English. So that's our criteria, and using that, we have narrowed ourselves down to about 40, just over now, but 40 plus case studies that meet those criteria. You'll see in the slides that I shared, we have included, at this stage, we haven't strictly cut off everybody. So if there's some certainly with the criteria not fully meeting the full LCIA criteria, we have still listed those. Partly because, you know, we wanted to share those slides, those studies with you in that pack so that you can raise things. So I mean, if we cut things out too much, then we thought people were going to raise things that we're missing. So we've tried to be a little bit more inclusive, but for the actual study, we would then perhaps be more strict in our criteria around indicators and time. And then the other aspect is, of course, you know, those studies, they're still relevant, even if it's carbon footprint, and would inform discussion and our wider views. But we probably wouldn't have it then as one of the shortlisted ones. If anyone's seen the previous meta studies in the series, you know, we have a short little piece on each study, and those studies would be the ones that really strictly meet these criteria. And of course, we want feedback on the criteria. That's one of the questions, if those are relevant, and we can talk more about that in the discussion. Yeah, and then also just to flag, I guess, at the end of that, we've listed other studies because there are, as I said, you know, we're focusing particularly on case studies, but we recognize there's much wider and broader and really rich literature here. A lot of really interesting review studies, wider topics on you know, how relevant is LCA to even do food packaging studies, that kind of thing. So those are absolutely important and would be included in our discussion and our thinking. So we've listed those. That's not exhaustive at this stage. I'm sure you probably come up more, but certainly I wanted to include those at the end there, just so that also you know that we have flagged those studies, even if they're not within our short list of case studies. But then, so moving on from within those 40 odd case studies that we have, we're now trying to distill them into the groups that so we can do a nice coherent report. We had the idea of 3 groupings within those studies that we can then present sort of how do you kind of group these or cluster them into food products or packaging archetypes. So, you know, so this very much reflects the literature that we've come across, and hopefully that's clear when you look at the lists of studies. So it's been sort of driven by, you know, we did a wide search and now we've tried to group them as sensibly as we can. And we certainly would like to invite your feedback on what you think of the grouping, or is there a better way? Also, just keeping in mind that we really want this to be recommendations. So ultimately to policymakers, what makes sense? How would you want to see these sort of, what would grab you or be applicable to how you would then develop your policy, and also for consumers. So we would certainly value feedback here, but these are, you know, how we've done it so far, looking at the 40 that we had. We sort of could group them into what we call refrigerated and into fresh produce and then pantry. So to go into those a little bit more detail, refrigerated, we kind of broadly grouped meat and seafood, dairy, and also prepared foods. And actually, I'll go to the next slide. The reason for doing that, in that they sort, you know, you can kind of see they start falling a similar packaging type, which was often a tray with a plastic wrap around it. So that's the most common meat packaging, and certainly also for prepared foods and cheese, you tend to see a wrap, and a tray can often polystyrene, but made of different materials. So within those, that broad group, we started to put those together. And also within, you know, when trying to group them, we saw particular features. So perhaps a feature with meat and prepared foods is often it's packaging that's contaminated with food residue. Sort of meat packaging, not typically they're easy to recycle. And because of that, the alternatives that come up quite often in the literature there is around bioplastics and the potential to do what the end of life options are for contaminated packaging, because it's not as relevant or as easy to recycle meat packaging. And then also very relevant and coming through as a strong theme in those articles is food waste. I think with meat being such a high impact food product, certainly carbon, you know, really high profile, preventing food waste in packaging is a key theme that really arises in those food packaging studies. and in the refrigerated products, that is. In the fresh produce, actually we see, actually I had a single slide, so maybe I'll, rather than go through each one on the slide, actually I can click to my more detailed slides. So I think I've really gone through refrigerated products without being on my slide, but essentially, so we saw the features and the themes, and that's just the number. And then, as I said, we have it that we've included some that don't meet all the criteria. And then we've also just highlighted what sort of themes we're seeing emerging, cross-cutting themes as we're calling it, emerging through. So as I said, it's bioplastics and food waste that come through quite strongly in the sort of the refrigerated products or the meat prepared foods category. Although very early on days, and certainly the idea is not to give results here, we thought maybe we'd just give a few teasers of what we are seeing. So I've already mentioned, the fact that we see food waste being really important, and often can be dominant in the study. It really changes the outcome depending if you include food waste or don't. I think an interesting one was perhaps also the importance of consumer behavior. And I think this we see in reusable in our other sub-studies, but really it's difficult to look at packaging without the consumer. And one of, I think two of the studies that we looked at here now already are showing that if your packaging is less appealing, it can lead to sitting longer on the shelf before it gets sold, and actually also increasing food waste. And also how easy it is for a consumer to extract all the product out of it, and more food residue in your packaging leads to higher food waste. So yeah, again, interesting aspects that we'll be exploring further there. Okay, so my next grouping there was fresh produce, and here we broadly looking at and mainly fruit and veg, but I put bread in there too because some of the studies on reusable crates are very similar between whether it's a bread reusable crate system or a fruit one. So that's why we kind of got labeled it more broadly as fresh produce. The little table again gives a bit of a breakdown, and then the detail was in the slides I shared previously. Here, the packaging features, it's quite broad, but here we're trying to look particularly at, you can see the difference between the cut fruit, which is somewhat, as I said, it's difficult to make these groupings because there's quite a lot of overlap, but there is a fair amount of overlap between cut fruit and then sort of meat packed, where you're more into packages, whereas coming through quite strongly in these studies, this set is the reusable transit packaging. So that's where we're seeing a lot of studies on reuse systems, and particularly around of whole fruit and vegetables in transit. And that's quite a rich field in the literature sense. And then the other ones we looked at or see is very perishable produce like lettuce and what can be done in terms of shelf life extension in packaging. So that's quite a difference. So they're more the feature of the bag and even nanoparticles and that sort of thing. So that's quite a difference. So it's quite broad in terms of the packaging archetypes within fresh produce. And then so again, a few early findings is that reusable show, especially here referring to the reusable crates or boxes, relative to the single-use wooden crate or cardboard box, certainly shows clear benefits. As in all packagings, the weight is really important, and then also the recycled content coming through. Biodegradable plastic is always an interesting one and a difficult one. We've certainly seen that in our previous studies, and we see it likely to encounter it again, of course, within the food packaging context, even more so. And interesting to see that it's often the assumptions and what's available in terms of end of life modeling that's quite critical in showing the benefit of biodegradable plastic or not, or bioplastics, biodegradable plastics. And then as with the meat findings, it's really less of these ones actually included food waste as a trend within the articles, but certainly shelf life is a really important consideration within studies on food, on fresh produce packaging as well. And then the final group, which we've actually here broken down into two, but these we broadly called shelf-stable packaging or food products. So that could be, you know, that's your pantry items, things that last long, and we've broken them into the liquids and then into the dry goods. So the slide is on the shelf-stable liquids. So things like long life milk, soup, canned goods, and then also pasta sauces, olives in sachets, and then tuna and cans. So also fairly broad in its food context. But this is one where we start to see the classic LCA, the food packaging studies or packaging studies of, you know, glass or metal or pouch or you know, laminate. It's the more the material studies that are in this group, and perhaps what we normally think of when we think of packaging studies in LCA. Yeah, so it's more around different packaging materials than perhaps the emphasis is on the other ones, and very few reuse actually. We literally one article, I think it's the honey one, where reusable jars for honey, but not that many in the literature that we're coming across on reusable packaging systems for shelf stable items. Similarly with the dry goods, so here we're talking more about the bags and the boxes for things like cereal and rice. We would love to do more on wrappers, sort of as such a big litter item or big worry item as chip packets and sweet packets, not finding a huge amount in the literature. Actually just 2 studies on wrappers, also snack food, and 1 for chocolate. So certainly be interested if anyone knows more research going on around wrappers, but generally, again, it's more around the materials, and some nice, interesting articles on sort of packaging simplification, because there's that trend, or has always been the trend, to put your bag in a box. So obviously, if you can take away the box, you're immediately eliminating a lot of packaging materials. So some interesting aspects there. We haven't got any early findings there. Early days, as I said. So summarizing broadly all those articles, there's very little, only one study that actually talked about, particularly had developed a marine plastic litter index. So, you know, I'm sure everyone who's working in LCA and packaging and in this field will know, you know, the issue of marine plastics and it not being well covered in our current life cycle impact assessment methods. And that's why we have Anne-Marie Brulé, who's going to be talking at the end of this workshop on marine plastic, on Marilco project, which I'm sure is also familiar to many about how they're working to bridge that gap. But that's certainly something in the literature, is that gap. Also quite an interesting one is that very Europe focused, all the literature we've come across, and very little in developing country context, which is sort of a challenge because we want a global study, and you know, often the littering aspects that we, you know, and the gaps in plastic management or waste management is in developing country contexts. So we would certainly welcome more studies if anyone knows about in the developing country contexts, because, you know, your recommendations can be certainly quite different. And then also, as I mentioned, not that many on the circular reuse, except with the exception of fruit transit, so fruit and veg transit packaging or distribution, I guess what I mean, but not much on the actual sort of reuse models. And that we'd certainly, you know, with such a circular economy focus, we would really like to be able to include more there. Which kind of brings me to, you know, our overall plan for the meta study, or the report really. So the meta study really will analyze the case studies and try and draw out overarching conclusions. But there are cross-cutting themes that I think are big themes at the moment, which is circular economy and food waste and marine litter, and those aspects we certainly would want to include in our report, even if we're not seeing, we have to look at the wider literature, those other references that I mentioned at the end of the pack there. And then also we've collaborated with Marilka on this because we know the marine litter is a big issue, and what certainly policymakers would like to see, and the general public would like to see in the recommendations, but would be missing just from a view of what's currently in the literature. So we have that collaboration that we're going to talk about, and Marie's going to talk about in a bit. And then also we certainly, we would welcome, even if it's not in the literature, examples of what's actually already working and on the ground. And a good example there is Loop. And we had a great conversation there already with Ellie Golden from Loop to inform us on what they're actually managing already on the ground, even if it's not reflected in the LCA literature as such. So we certainly want to include those practices or what's already happening in the broader findings of the report. So we welcome those sort of collaborations as well. So that brings me to sort of the end of my overview, as I really welcome you to look at the actual listing of studies, certainly with the view of please providing, if you can fill any of those gaps or anything that you can see that we've missed or would like to share with us. We would really value that. But we're going to do some fun polls just to get your instant feedback here. But yeah, as well as sort of welcoming your questions and your comments. So I'm going to hand back to Claudia while I get the poll going.
Thank you so much, Pippa, and that was extremely insightful, and we have been receiving lots of question and answer, and thanks to Yvonne also for addressing some of them. Some questions I've marked them and we will answer them live. So we will get to those in a minute, but grab your cell phones. There is a code. Go to www.menti.com using your cell phone and dial the code that is appearing on the screen. As I mentioned at the beginning, we really want to engage you throughout the process from the very beginning. Starting from the title of the report, we'll be referring to this as the supermarket food packaging to make sure that we differentiate from the previous study that we have done in terms of takeaway food packaging that we have already published. And because we thought supermarket food packaging would be easy enough to understand and for our main target audience, that is the policymakers and member states. But we do understand that it might be limiting and perhaps retail food packaging might be more appropriate. So we ask you here to give us your preference, in fact, which title do you think describes in a more appropriate manner, in fact, what Pippa has been describing would be covered in terms of content? At the moment, we see that there is fairly even spread. So please keep voting. And it's great to see such a huge participation from so many various countries around the globe. So that's wonderful. And as Pippa said, we are really looking forward to receive from you more literature that can have a bigger geographical balance in terms of coverage, so that the findings that we draw can actually be really global. But it's great to see still more responses coming in. In the meantime, that we wait for these responses to the first question to come in, Pippa, I wanted to pass to you a question from Richard Ali. How are you including the food safety implication, necessary sanitation and prevention of cross-contamination with reusable system if used in meat and poultry?
Yeah, I think at the moment, I would say we're not seeing any reusable being promoted. So I mean, going back, this is a meta study, so we're very much reflecting what's in the literature and what we can draw out of the literature, hence this sort of emphasis on saying what's out there and what we'll be kind of looking at. And very much interesting, and I guess particularly for the reasons that you've just raised, is we don't, in that refrigerated products, the first group, there were no reusable alternatives put forward. So it's perhaps because, as I say, it's just not a feasible because of the food safety aspect. So we're seeing the reusable mainly in the fruit and vegetable crates, which don't have that issue, although they are normally in systems, there's sanitizing between of the crates, but it doesn't have, that high requirement. And I think the other is even in the loop returnable packaging model, it tends to be more not on food products, but on consumer products and that kind of thing, sort of personal care products, which don't fall in the scope of our study. But there are some usable products, and I think maybe that's where we need to talk more within the industry, because we're not seeing that in the literature particularly now.
Thank you. And there is another question, and please keep sending through your questions in the Q&A box. From the chat, it's more difficult for us to be able to address the questions, whether live or typing. So please send them through in the Q&A box. But there is a question from Anna that you have identified the 3 food clusters, and Anna would like to know how about food loss in terms of food produce, so ready meals, salad, etc. She's aware, so it's great that she's been following our studies, because she's aware that we have addressed this type of packaging, the single use and reusable, in our takeaway food packages, packaging LCA meta studies. But are there any takeaway trends that are being strengthened due to COVID and that will be covered under this new LCA meta study?
You mean particularly COVID?
Yeah. Particularly takeaway food packaging.
Yeah, which I think we are trying, I think, and even in the poll that we're doing now, we do want to be quite clear on the differentiation between what this study looks at and what the previous the takeaway food packaging one looked at. And I think there is, obviously it gets a bit gray, and then in our first group there, we prepared meals. So when a prepared meal is wrapped and sold in a supermarket, you could call that takeaway food packaging because you take it away, but to eat it. But I think generally our focus really is not on the food takeaway food packaging. So it's particularly we're looking for things that are not meant to be consumed on the go, but actually taken, as you would a supermarket food and taken home. So yeah, it's difficult because there is a bit of crossover in gray areas, but trying not to address the takeaway food packaging because we feel it's been done, and it's a whole nother big issue, I think, with a different set of criteria or issues, let's say, that we don't need to. We've already got enough differentiations in this retail food packaging space without needing to go there as well, I think.
Thank you, Pippa. And shall we move to the next? We have another question prepared for all of you, still on Menti, using Menti on your phone. The code will remain the same, so you can just, you should be able to see the next question already.
Okay, yeah, I just gave the results of the previous one.
Okay, so at the moment for the previous one, we have a slight preference with 57% to maintain the current title on the supermarket food packaging. If we need to make a conscious decision. So if there is a strong rationale for people that have voted for retail food packaging, please do drop us a line in the Q&A box so that we can maintain and analyze those rationale in more details after the webinar. Thank you so much. So let us move to the next question. How should we cluster the packaging? Now, Pippa has been showing you the 3 archetypes that we have been looking at that have been kind of arising from the literature review that we have been doing. And the main question is really, do we want to, at the moment we are clustering them by food product. Do we continue with this approach do you think it is the most useful approach for, if, for example, you are a policymaker of a country and you need to issue a policy, which approach would be the most useful? If we clustered our recommendation by food product, as we have been doing, or by packaging type? This is really what we want to understand and try to gather also from your expert feedback. So thank you so much for already sending in your inputs. And while you are typing your votes in there, while you are putting in your votes, Pippa, another question from Sarah: is the focus of the end of life packaging for bio-based plastic important due to local waste management, for example, where landfilling has an important rate? Bio-based raw materials production have a considerable impact on land use, but is not often hidden. So the question there is really whether the focus of end-of-life packaging for bio-based plastic is important because of waste management at the local level.
Yeah, definitely. I think we see with the bioplastics or biodegradable plastics, specifically as a subgroup of bioplastics, that how it's handled at end of life can really change the impact. So if it just goes into a landfill versus where it does actually go into a industrial composting or something like that, or if it, worst, gets incinerated. So they are, within, but it tends to be, there are very few countries with that composting infrastructure. So often it's done more in a theoretical or scenario-based kind of thing, showing that there is this potential to compost the food with the food loss, the packaging and the food contaminated packaging all together, or in a biodigester, and then it certainly does look like a good option. But there's very few using actual sort of, let's say, national statistics on composting or that, because it's generally tends to be theoretical, showing the potential for bioplastics. And maybe that's where it is at the moment, which is a difficult one, because, we need to be absolutely important to take the context into account when making recommendations. And so that's definitely something that comes in, and it's certainly been a big theme even in the previous meta studies. So it's difficult to recommend. So even if a study shows a biodegradable plastic in a particular context would look very good, it's not going to be in all contexts if it's a country where it's bioplastics is just, where all the plastic is just being landfilled or littered, or that. So it is certainly a consideration that we need, and it's not always supported in the literature. So it's one where we take studies and have to interpret them carefully for the recommendations and the discussion.
Thank you so much, Pippa. And I think we can show the results for this second poll. And I thank you very much, Yuki and Kristen, for sharing also your perspective a bit more in detail in the Q&A and in the chat box. So both of them, in fact, they favor, and I think the preference is clearly for presenting the finding by food product. So Yuki says, in fact, that the clustering by food product is more useful because food losses are related to food type more than the food packaging. So if we want to analyze the cross-cutting issue, which we have brought up in terms of food losses, the clustering the product, the archetype by food product, in fact, for Yuki seems more reasonable. And Kristen agrees with this approach by food products for policymakers, but she mentions that presenting by packaging type might be better for the industry. So depending on who the main target audience is, it might be useful to also consider presenting the results maybe in the two format types. So this is something for us to consider. For the moment, the main target audience, as we said, would be policymakers, LCA practitioners. But indeed, if we plan, as we scope the study, we plan to issue consideration also for the industry, then we definitely need to consider opting for the other type of clustering, basically. So thank you so much for that. And I believe we have one more poll for you to make the session more even more interactive. And this would be the last question we would like to ask for you today. And this is a bit longer in the sense that we would like to just check, go back to the basis of our research and really check whether you agree with the LCA study selection criteria that Pippa has shared with you. So we have from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The main criteria that we would like to test today with you is really the fact that we have opted for studies that they cover the full life cycle, including also preferably food waste. The fact that study must consider multiple potential impacts, so not just one specific impact, for example, carbon footprint. And in this one, I would like to just clarify something. We are excluding them from the meta-analysis, but there are some considerations that are quite important, and we are bringing them into the discussion piece of the meta study. So there will be one part of the study that is the meta-analysis where we strictly consider these LCAs that meet all the criteria, but there are some other studies that might have not been peer-reviewed, or there are some other considerations that have come in from other sources and reviewers, etc., that we find relevant and will bring into the consideration to draw the final conclusion. The other criteria is studies that are not older than 10 years. And finally, do you agree with the fact that we are selecting studies that are peer-reviewed or published in peer-reviewed journal? So thank you for casting your vote on this. And I will continue with some live questions. So for the Solène mentions that for the food industry, it's better to explore alternatives for each food product, as all food packaging choices are a result of the food technical specification. So actually, this kind of goes a bit in competition with the previous statement. So for the food industry, in fact, it seems that it might still be interesting and useful to cluster the products by food product, in fact. So thank you for that comment. And I'm just checking Maria. She says, as far as I'm concerned, you are looking into past to make recommendations for the future. However, in terms of research development and innovation, historical studies and information don't necessarily reflect future opportunities. How are you considering ongoing development, for example, in renewable materials and net zero packaging alternative when making recommendations for future policy making? Pippa, would you like to try and give an answer to this, and I'll be able to add a bit also what I think.
Thanks. Yes, certainly you can add in. I mean, I totally agree. Obviously, there is always that problem. But whenever we're looking, if we want evidence-based decision making, which I think what life cycle assessment tries to be all about, we're inevitably doing what you say is because case studies, what you have to work with, it tends to be historical, and it's just not possible to know what's coming in the future, but we can learn from what we're seeing in the current. Certainly that supports not looking too past. I agree, there's a lot of really recent, coming out all the time, actually 2021 studies, and I really, obviously that would be more sensible to base it on as most current and research as possible. And also there is LCA, prospective LCA to try and look forward and predict the trends. So certainly like with the bioplastics I was talking about. So even if there is, in the previous question, even if there isn't infrastructure yet, we can model what that infrastructure could be and what it would then look like for biodegradable plastics. The problem is then, you've got to make sure that when you recommend it, it needs to be in that future context where that future infrastructure is in place. So yeah, I guess the only thing I could say is we certainly would try and be cognizant of the most current and whatever's coming out in the literature, but this is by its very nature a meta-analysis. So we are limited to looking what is there. It's not a new research project. It's about trying to gather the body of knowledge that's there. And by definition, that is somewhat historical. You're correct.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Pippa. And there is more in the chat in terms of discussing around which criteria should be considered as secondary. For example, the age of the study might be considered as a secondary criteria. There is a suggestion there if the conclusion of the study are still valid and if the study meets all the other criteria, for example. That's a suggestion from UK. And also, I would like to check if there is any other question. And thank you so much. First of all, we can maybe pull the results for this final. I think they're already showing actually.
Yeah,
on
they
the
come
screen.
up as they go,
Okay, great. So basically, it seems that there is people agree quite fondly with all the criteria that we have, except for the one that is less sure. Basically, is the studies that are not older than 10 years. Even if there is still 4 out of 5, basically, in terms of agreement. So thank you so much for that. That's going to be very useful feedback for us. Pippa, one more. I would like to take a few more questions before I pass it to the next. I pass to the next segment of this workshop. Have you considered using other sustainable principle as a complement to LCA?
For me to answer, yeah, I mean, I think that's what I was trying to allude to, and I certainly say we need to be aware of the wider literature, and marine litter is the huge obvious one here. So that's not reflected in the LCA studies, but we know that it is an issue and needs to be considered in the discussion. So yes, we will, and the food contamination issue that was raised earlier. So yeah, we have, you have to do this within the context. And even though my background and then the wider team is mostly life cycle assessment, we certainly will read as widely and cast the sort of the study as wide within the bounds of reasonable as well, because it needs to be capped at some, and there's a lot of literature and a really wide and interesting field. So. But yes, as much as possible. And I think the previous sub-studies were very similar, the menstrual products one, for instance, so many issues around there that go wider than life cycle assessment and just the environmental performance. And you can't recommend one thing without really taking the whole context into account. And we'll certainly keep that in mind for this meta study too.
And speaking of context, that feeds very well into the question from Marcel, which is asking whether we intend to consider different recommendations for different regions of the planet, given that we all live in different contexts, etc. For example, the waste management structure, the available technology for packaging, the habits of population, and how do we intend to do that? We have some experience that we have developed on this from the previous meta studies, but if you would like to answer that, Pippa.
Yeah, as Claudia laughs, that's exactly what we battled with, because when we tried to do the matrix that she showed, it is very much to try and get away from the fact that you get, it depends as an answer in LCA, it depends on the context, it always does. So we've tried very hard to actually define those contexts so that we can take out the it depends and actually show that in this context, this would be preferred. So, I mean, it's always a, it's difficult, but I think it is very valuable to always keep that context clearly in any recommendations, because it is so. And that's a little bit of a concern with this one, as I raised, because the literature is very Europe focused. So we certainly would, to be able to do that and take the different contexts, we need the studies in the wider context. And at the moment, we're not seeing that so much. There's only one sort of study that's, I think, was Indonesian that we've come across that's not sort of Europe or North America. So certainly welcoming anyone researching from the wider world to please give us their references and share their studies.
And I think one of the key findings that are shared at the very beginning from all the studies that we have, all the meta studies that we have done so far on single-use plastic products, indeed, one of the key findings is that there is no one solution that fits all. It all depends on the context, very context specific, and that's why it's so important to differentiate also from in terms of end-of-life technology, the geographical context, the consumer profile, etc. So definitely this is something that we are aware of and we will be very carefully concentrating on as we try to draft the conclusions. One last questions and that links to this, in fact, from Richard Ali. Do you foresee including a level of risk uncertainty in your recommendations? And that is, I think, is a part of any LCA, in fact, recommendation.
For me as well. I mean, I think absolutely it's really difficult, and you'll see even in the previous, sometimes all the disclaimers around the recommendations become longer than the recommendations, because we need to clearly say that, you know, very clearly keep the context in mind and that it doesn't apply in all situations. And so, you know, but in terms of quantifying, not all, occasionally studies actually do quantify uncertainty within LCAs, but it's still not the norm. It's more the exception where you actually get that variability or uncertainty included in the answers. But certainly something we always allude to and try and make clear that, yeah, LCA is full of uncertainty.
So definitely the shortcomings of LCA as a methodology, as a way of assessing the environmental impacts will be included in the meta-analysis, as we have been doing so far. So thank you so much, Pippa, for this fired up question and answer session, and everybody for the active engagement. I would like to pass to the next segment, as I mentioned, and I would like to then call Anne-Marie Boulet on screen. Anne-Marie is the assistant professor at CIREG University, Department of Chemical Engineering at the Polytechnic of Montreal, Canada. And she will introduce to us what is Marilka and how the project will be contributing to this meta study. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for joining us today. And over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Very well, thank you.
Great. So thank you, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. I will discuss with you today how we can introduce impacts from marine litter into the studies. So as you know by now, when we are comparing different alternatives, which include single-use plastics, we unfortunately at this point in LCA do not have any methodologies to introduce the potential environmental damages of the plastic litter that reach the environment. And this definitely introduces a bias in one direction or another, either because we believe we should completely avoid single-use plastic because of this litter, which must be avoided at all costs, or conversely, because we underrepresent the potential environmental impact from the single-use plastic alternatives. So one way or the other, there is a strong need to develop metrics in order to integrate these emissions into the environment and convert them into potential problems and damages on the areas of protection. So it was with this objective in mind, because as we know, we do observe some effects on the ecosystems, and we also by now suspect some effects on human health via inhalation or via ingestions. So it was with this in mind, in order to introduce and quantify these impacts into the life cycle impact assessment methodologies, that we founded in 2019 the working group Marilka for marine impacts in LCA. So for some of you who have been around for some time, you may know the working group WULCA, Water Use in LCA. So this group is based and structured very much in a similar way as it has allowed us for water to develop methodologies and build consensus to integrate impacts of water use in LCA. And now for marine impacts of plastics, we are starting pretty much at the same place as we were 10 years ago for water. So when we launched the group in 2019, the plan of the first phase was to develop a framework in order to set the table and develop all the different impact pathways that will need to be quantified in order to integrate the impacts of marine litter in LCA. Phase 2 and 3 are planned as phase 2 was the setting the projects and the work packages and launching the projects to develop these methodologies. And phase 3 is about building consensus and developing recommendations, at least with what we have at this point, on recommending metrics for the marine litter impact, specifically starting with plastics. So phase 1 has been completed, and this is the framework that was published this year, which you can find online, a paper by Woods and colleagues. It was our first deliverable, and this is where we identified all the different boxes and impact pathways that should be quantified in order to have a comprehensive pictures of marine impacts emissions in LCA, starting with plastics. Of course, we cannot start with all of that at the same time. So what we have prioritized is what you see is the hard line boxes, where we want to assess the macro and micro plastics emissions specifically into freshwater and marine environments, and quantifying their potential impacts from physical effects on ecosystem quality. The other boxes that you see will also be developed, just one step back, please. The other boxes that you see will also be developed in the future, sooner or later, depending on which boxes. But what we want to at least come up with at first within the time frame of, it's also part of the GLAM project of the Life Cycle Initiative, is at least the physical effect of biota of micro and microplastics, which corresponds to, and you can move to the next slide, indeed quantifying this one new impact categories called physical impacts of biota at the midpoint level, which then translates into endpoint impacts on ecosystem quality areas of protection. So in order to do this, as a brief reminder, when we quantify damages on ecosystem quality, we multiply an emission with a characterization factor. And in this case, emission-based characterization factors are built of 3 subparameters. The first one being the fate factor, which describes which compartments and subcompartments the emissions will end up in and for how long. And the exposure and effect factor quantifies the actual damage or problems that this will cause to the ecosystem due to the exposure of these emissions in this compartment. So actually the second deliverable of Marilka already provide for microplastics exposure and effect factors, which were published also this year by Lavoie and colleagues, and provides us with effect factors in PAF, which can be converted into PDF per concentration of exposed microplastics. So the big challenge that we are now working on is the development of the fate factor, for which we have already several projects going on. But yes, indeed. So just going quickly for showing you what has been done for the effect factor. What we have found is that we could use the available data on ecotoxicity to derive a species sensitivity distribution curves. And we were able to base this on 36 species representing 9 phyla. Normally in life cycle impact assessments in ecotoxicology, if we have 3 phyla, we have reached the minimum. So 9 phyla was an acceptable number. And with these data, we were able to derive one effect factor. In this case, it's a generic effect factor, not polymer specific. We also have polymer specific effect factors, but we found that with the uncertainty, using one single effect factor for all types of polymer was just as well, because there's high uncertainty and variation between the different types of polymers. And this effect factor, if we compare to the other effects of the register substances that we have in LCA, specifically in new stocks, was found to be of moderate, if we can say, toxic effect. It's not actually toxicity in this case, as I mentioned, it's physical effect, but the level of damage, if you want, is comparable to just about the middle of the range of the substances that we have in terms of effect following an exposition. So this is for the exposure and effect. And then, as I mentioned, the big challenge that we have still remaining is the fate factor development. And here we have several projects ongoing in order to fully develop this. It's quite a complex question. One of the projects has already mapped a framework which will look at all the different, and you can advance all the animation on the slide. Thank you, Elena. It's quite complex because we have to quantify all the exchanges between the different compartments, sub-compartments, because there's different factors that will be influencing them, because there will be different wave actions, so UV radiation, different exposure of different concentration of biota, and then all the transport mechanism between these, which will also be influenced by, for example, fouling, suspension, resuspension, etc. So we are in the process of quantifying this in details, and this will not be finished on time to be able to use directly this input for the project. However, we have learned already quite a bit from the development of this project, and we have started to test what we knew in order to see what kind of conclusion we could draw already from the effect factor that we have and the knowledge we have started to gain on the fate factors modeling. We have actually applied this in a case study, which which compared with the collaboration here of a producer for food containers, biodegradable food containers made of wood pulp, which we compared with expanded polystyrene, as well as bagasse made in China. And this is in the Quebec context here in Canada, and as well with the reusable plate. And what we wanted to do with this study is indeed do the LCA of the different alternatives and test our preliminary characterization factors using the range of information that we could find. We have tested this on the expanded polystyrene at the end of life, so reaching aquatic and marine ecosystems. We have also tested it for tire and road wear particles in order to see how this would compare if we are applying what we have on different types of polymers and types of emissions. We will focus here on the expanded polystyrene, which will be quite comparable to what could be done for this study. So what we have done is look at the three main parameters that is strongly influencing the fate, and looked at literature and available data to provide the complete range of possible values that we could have for these three parameters. So the first one is fragmentation. How much of the microplastics of the entire container will be fragmented in microplastics? And here we have looked at a time scale of 100 years. And we had to look at different scenarios from the best, average, and worst case scenarios with different values for the fragmentation, the total fragmentation of the microplastics into microplastics. Then similarly for the degradation rates in marine environment for expanded polystyrene, we found quite different values in the literature. So we took a large range from either very fast degradation or very slow degradation that still could be relevant for expanded polystyrene in marine environment. And lastly, the other important parameters that influences the fate is the sedimentation rate. Even though expanded polystyrene is quite a buoyant polymer with biofouling, we know that it can sediment, and we find it in the sediment. So we have here again tested different sedimentation rates. So with all of those scenarios, we were able to develop different characterization factors with representing, again, the best, medium, and worst case scenarios, which gives us a range. Here you see the orange point on the line is the expanded polystyrene characterization factors compared to other characterization factors for toxic substances in the marine environment. So we see that it may lie on the more higher part of the curve compared to other substances. But when we look at the uncertainty brought by the different scenarios of the data that we don't exactly have, it could actually cover pretty much almost the entire spectrum. So it was good news because we know we are in the realm of toxicity of other substances, but yet we know that these are very important parameters to look into, the degradation, fragmentation, and sedimentation, in order to better model and quantify potential impacts of the emissions, in this case of expanded polystyrene. However, when we look at the tire and word rare particles, and this is the blue dot and line here on the left, we see that here the uncertainty is actually quite smaller because there was less uncertainty on, for example, the sedimentation rate because of the higher density of these particles and better known mechanisms for sedimentation and for degradation. So now what we wanted to do with this indeed is to apply it in our case study. And here we show you just the preliminary results showing the damage on ecosystem quality. So we also done that for human health, but the goal was to show how would these added impacts from the marine litter compare to the rest of impacts of ecosystem quality, because this is ultimately what we want to know. So you can see the 4 different alternatives, and you see that if we don't take into account any of the black impacts of the EPS, the last 3 alternatives are quite comparable, whether it's EPS, wood pulp, or reusable plate, ceramic plate, they're quite comparable. Then if we add the average scenarios for marine littering of EPS, this is the solid black line that you see, they still remain actually quite comparable. And it's when we add the worst case scenario potentials that we see that the EPS impacts could raise significantly enough to make this scenario less environmentally interesting than the wood pulp or the reusable plates, for example. So you see the range of variation here for the impacts. It's almost 3 orders of magnitude. So again, quite a lot of uncertainty, but of course we know where this uncertainty comes from in this case. So with these preliminary results, what we wanted to show is what we would like to do also in these comparative studies is to select the studies where we are able to do something similar by then compiling all the basic data required to integrate this, so the type of material, the weight, etc. And then using the Plastic Leak Project guidelines, which we have used also in this project in order to quantify the littering rate. And as this was mentioned, this will vary significantly from one region to another. So we will be able to test this hypothetically for different regions of the world with the different littering rates. And then by researching the key parameters that we have identified as fragmentation, degradation, and sedimentation, and providing hypotheses and testing the ranges applicable for the specific polymers, we will be able to integrate also a preliminary way to combine the results on ecosystem quality into the results of the LCA, and then provide conclusions that would support decision-making in this direction. So there's probably lots of questions. I've presented this very high-level results for now, but I think it's already a step forward to guide us in the right direction. Just want to mention also that the microplastics impacts here were not quantified, only the microplastics, for the simple reason that the microplastic effect factors are not quite ready yet and will not be ready in the next few months, more in the current of the following year. So it is also coming, but for the purpose of this study, we will only be considering the microplastics, so once the fragmentation has taken place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. And there are a few questions that have come through, and there is also an offer to try and engage more on EPS specific details, so that you can do in offline as well. But in the interest of time, I would like you to, if you can address the question from Emilia. So Emilia would like to know for the TRWP, what is the time horizon considered?
Yes, thank you, Emilia. So it was also a 100-year time horizon in terms of degradation I'm assuming it's for the degradation question. So it was 100 years.
Great. Thank you so much for that clarification. And another clarification from Kirsten. She would like to know what constitutes land transformation and occupation for reusable packaging.
Actually, I can answer.
Yeah, go ahead, Elena. Thank you.
Actually, those results are being corrected right now. So most of the land occupation was coming from the soap. So the reusable container needs to be washed, and the results were very sensitive to the type of soap used. And we created another Canada-specific soap, which had the lower land occupation impacts, but basically depends on the type of soap.
Great. Thank you so much, Elena, for answering that question as well. And
can I just jump in 1 second?
To add, yes,
so Elena,
please.
who just answered the question, is actually the main author of this work. So I thank her for that, and she will be also highly involved in this work. And as I'm not able to have access to all the details in the chat, don't hesitate to reach out to us if there's any further connections you would like to make also regarding this work.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And from our side, we are looking forward to see how we could best integrate any latest funding that you will have from a marine litter perspective into our study as well. And that is the base of the partnership that we have. So in the interest of time, I want to thank all the panelists for having joined us and for the great reactivity in answering all the questions that have been fired at us in the question and answer in the chat box. Many thanks. You can also please contact us for any other question at the email addresses that you see now on the screen. Many thanks for all of you that have joined today. As I mentioned at the beginning, in terms of next steps, what will happen is that please also contact these 2 email addresses if you are not yet subscribed into the reviewer list and you would like to be part of the reviewer committee for the food packaging study. We will be now incorporating all the comments that we have received from you today. And please, if you have further comments, please send them through. If you have any literature studies that you think we have missed out on, please do send them through. We will be welcoming any feedback from you until the end of December. After that cutoff date, we'll be basically starting drafting. We'll be sending the first draft to you in the at the beginning of the second quarter for review, and then the second draft, the second and final draft, will come back to you before we send it for layout to make sure that we have addressed all your comments correctly. There is no misinterpretation, that we are all satisfied with the content of the study. So again, thank you very much for your engagement today. Thank you very much for Ellie Chang from US EPA for having joined us today, and for the partnership with the UN Environment Program. And I wish you all a good rest of the day and evening, wherever you are connected from. Thank you so much, and we look forward to stay engaged.